their seats up front.
No one ever wants to sit at the front.
No, in the UK, you've got to make a fake front row, and then right before it starts, pull all
Pull
the
the
seats
chairs
out.
out.
Whereas in the US, everyone's like, yeah, oh yeah.
That doesn't surprise me.
I know. They're way too keen.
Well, welcome everybody. Is that, there we go, that's on. Thank you very much for coming to this event. I'm sure a lot of you are following different international news, or whether it's tech and industry and business or general kind of social concerns. I think what this book sort of discusses is the varying and wide and ubiquitous nature of AI and how it can change things. So thank you all for being here. Welcome to Kyle, the author of the book. Looking forward to having some questions with you. And thank you to everyone at the Common Press Bookshop for hosting us so kindly. And of course, everyone at Byline Times and Byline Books. So to kick off, I wondered, Kyle, if you could just tell us a little bit about your background and what brought you to write on this subject particularly.
Yeah, so I have, since I was a kid, I've always been just obsessed with politics and social change. And so I worked in politics for years and years and years. And then, ooh.
Ignore me.
Oh, right. And through from the 2010 UK election onward, I got really, really interested in how you integrated technology and social media and data into all this stuff. And for me, I was very early adopter of this is going to be amazing. We're going to be able to reach tons of new voters. But slowly over time, as we all saw, it turned into a complete and utter disaster. And it was when I was working on the 2016 US presidential election in the US that it sort of crystallized the role of disinformation in politics and what that was doing to breaking down shared reality and our ability to sort of function as a society. And after the 2016 election, I came back to the UK and ended up being involved in the Cambridge Analytica scandal, the release of all the documents, the Vote Leave scandal. And from there, I sort of was deeply, deeply embedded in tech and society, tech and democracy. So last year when ChatGPT released 3.5, and all of a sudden there was this sort of supercomputer that looked like a person, sound like a person, all of these things, my heart just started racing, thinking, so we've done nothing about the social media problem, and now we're adding this AI problem. And I think what happened very early on was this red herring of the existential threat, the robots are going to kill us. I don't think we have enough time to get to the point where the robots are going to kill us, because AI is going to hurt so many other things first, to a degree that will probably drive us to kill ourselves. And it's really, really dark. And anyone
Welcome, everyone.
and anyone who knows me will know that I'm a very upbeat, positive person. And it's because I've sort of resigned myself to the scale of the problem. But what came about with the books was just this real sense of, I was thinking about, how do I explain this to my dad?
Yeah.
You know, he's 68 years old, never really been super techie or that political. And why are all these topics always so inaccessible to people when they deeply affect their lives? And that was the lens through which I wrote the first book, Little Black Book of Data and Democracy, and I've written all the books since, was, would my dad be able to understand this topic if he read this book? And for me, it's so important in politics to be able to allow things to be accessible for people, especially in democracies. Like, this is our society. This is our country. Why shouldn't we be informed around these topics, especially when they're fundamentally changing our lives? And the series has now sold over 10,000 books.
Which is amazing.
Yeah.
More books on sale, please. Just to pick up on a couple of things then, just for a little introduction to my work, I'm Tanels Youssef. One of the things I do is work on the prevention and regulation of it's a campaign to stop killer robots. It's obviously it's one of those buzz terms, but really it's around the increasing use of AI in weapons technology, or providing for weapons technology through erroneous data and such things, and how that can specifically harm more demographics than others, and of course lead us completely out of control, which are violations of international humanitarian law and laws of armed conflict, which are basically the laws of war. So those are the things that in part I work on, but also I had a little bit of involvement in data bill in the EU and some of the online harms here. So this kind of disproportionate and bias within the data and this misrepresentation, of course, is a wide concern. But on that, there is clearly, as you've just said, it being so ubiquitous, it being a potential, if not influence, at best influence, at worst threat in various sectors of our lives, and the change happening so abruptly. What made you choose this sort of succinct form? I can tell you one experience of myself where we lobby at the UN. There are lots of diplomats who don't understand this technology. They use the terms, they say unpredictable, they say bias, and then, to be fair, they're not technicians, they're diplomats or they're lawyers. And we have to do a lot of work just explaining it to them, and they're making international law and global policy decisions. So I completely agree with you that an informed public needs to know. So how do you take that level of detail and make it something comprehensive and this succinct?
That's a really good question. And so where I always start is, okay, we need to have really accessible language. So no huge words that are not widely used, number one. Number two, tons of examples that make it really relatable to everyday experience. So like, this would be like if, those types of things. And three, deeply, deeply researched. So if you've read A Little Black Book, you'll know that there are over 100 footnotes in every book. These are deeply, deeply researched books, but that doesn't mean that can't also be accessible. And the reason I think I picked the format of a book, which is just slightly larger than a smartphone, is because it's the idea of putting the screen down and engaging with something. And you'll as well with the chapters, they're very short, and that's intentional. I don't want people to feel like they have to read for an hour to get something out, and you can go back to it. So really short, really succinct chapters, conversational style, and humor. I mean, I think they're funny. I mean,
I agree. Well, on that then, in order to explain a little bit more and expand into the book a little bit for the benefit of people here who probably haven't had the chance to read it yet, you divide AI broadly into 4 sections. Could you tell us a little bit about how you did that and what that really means for you?
Yeah, so I was trying to think about, like, if you want to understand AI, how can you break it down in a way that's more accessible? So for me, it's simple, siloed, smart, and sentient. They all start with S because I like when things sound nice together. Simple is things that a year ago we thought were quite complex. So autocomplete when you write an email, that's artificial intelligence. And now to the degree where even algorithms on social media that are delivering you content are relatively simple versions of AI. Largely harmless historically, algorithms obviously hugely harmful. And then you move to siloed. Siloed for me is very clearly input in, it does something, input out. But we know from the beginning what we're trying to get out of it. And the best example, and this is the area where it's most effective, is around medical research, right? So a human can only hold so much information in our brains. But if you give AI 100,000 MRI scans of a body part and say, what's consistent in these for identifying if someone has cancer early on, it's able to tell you very well what you can see consistently. But we know beginning we're saying, okay, we want to try and identify ways that we can early onset cancer in these images, go. Really not that harmful. Smart is where we are now. Smart is these large language models, your chat GPTs, where you're talking to it and it's talking back to you like a person would talk to you. And so the large language model, oftentimes people think of it as a large amount of data going in. Right? Actually, that's not what it is. A large language model is that it can make a large number of decisions about the data. And the main decision it's making is what word should go next. And in the context of these chat tools, it's basically the content of the internet that's informing it, which these companies have used and not paid for to develop that. And then, of course, the last piece is sentient. So that's when the computers come and kill us. We're not there yet.
Unless you're in a war zone, in which case we're very much there.
Yes, exactly.
But in the general sort of the robots are coming to get us and they've clubbed together and they've decided the human race is superfluous. Yes, I think we're quite far away from that too. So talking about the big risks and dispelling a little bit of some of the potentially hysterical overhype, or is that true? Picking up something you said about the MRI scans. I mean, some of the things that we do is research, as you said, the problems in the data, aside from the fact that it's often illegally scraped. It's the property of authors, of artists. They own that IP. There are some works for newspapers to try and get a kind of royalty from the data that's been used. But aside from that, I think a neat example of how even at as you say, the sort of simple level, there can be problems. They did a lot of MRI analysis and some testing, and there is an example. There are lots of these examples throughout AI use, whether it's credit, whether it's justice decisions, particularly in the US around sort of bail or prison times, which are heavily biased because of this scraping of the internet. And the social biases that exist online because of who's mainly had the access to the technology. And they kept diagnosing, or this robotic tool was diagnosing tumors, and what it had actually found, and they were erroneous, they were not a true result, was there was a fine pencil scratch on the original scan that it modelled on, and it was trying to replicate the pencil scratch because we're never quite sure what computers are actually processing and which bits of data they find relevant. So they can often sift the things that are relevant. And it's only if it appears to make the right decisions for long enough, we sort of say, it's working, it's safe. And then it's in the real world, you often get problems. So if something that simple, as we've moved on now and sort of accepted to this extent, can have such a fundamental flaw, what's your kind of risk assessment of the other more advanced areas, like the supposition that LLMs produce these human-like creatures and how that can affect our life?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the best examples are as you said, and when you look at technology, especially when it's when it's taking data from the real world, you have to remember that it's just going to repeat what exists in the real world. So the criminal justice one is a great example, right? We know that policing is racist, particularly in the US, in the UK, pretty much everywhere. If you put a ton of data in, and I talk about this example in the book, and you say, where should we police more based on where there's crime occurring? Shocker, it tells you to police low income and communities of color, as opposed to saying to it, how do we reduce systemic racism in policing, right? So the output ends up being solely dependent on what you're putting into it. And I think that there are so many examples of this. And I think the bigger question, the bigger problem is that humans seem to be deeply willing to assume the computer is right over people. And so I think about the example of when we move to a stage where facial recognition is the only way you can access your bank account. And then the facial recognition says, no, it's not you. And you're like, but yeah, it is, it's me. This is my money. And it says, no, it's not you. And every human says, well, the computer says it's not you, and therefore it's not you. And that seems like a small example, except like all of your money is in a bank account.
So fundamental,
right?
Yeah.
So fundamental. And I think when you look at the broader development, particularly around AI, and there was a great interview in Time magazine, Billy Perigo with the head of AI at Meta. And he was saying, I don't know why everyone keeps focusing on the negatives. Like, what we should be focusing on the positives. And this is the big divide between tech and people who work in human rights, civil society. And you start in civil society, you start in what is the worst possible thing that can happen. And then you work backwards from there. If you're in tech, even after everything that's happened, they still are starting with a place, but wouldn't it be cool if? You know, and when you look at how little we've done, I think social media is a really important example to go to when we talk about AI for a few reasons. The first reason is that it's almost all just the same companies, right, who are the major players in AI, are the major players in social media. In 2020, there was an insurrection and almost a coup in the United States that was largely organized and facilitated on social media. Shortly after, there was a similar situation in Brazil. But just in the United States, not a single federal law has been passed to regulate social media when there was an insurrection. And not only are we looking at it that in the sense of there was an insurrection, then nothing's been done, these companies are now, their election integrity teams, which work specifically on threats to election and democracy, have reduced in size by between 70 and 90% ahead of this year's election in the United States. So you've had no federal law changes, and the companies themselves have gotten worse, even though they have a case study of an insurrection. And the reason I use that example is because AI's change, societal level impact and change, is so much greater than social media. It's more akin to before there was nuclear energy, nuclear bombs, and after. So if we see how little governments have done and how little companies have done to make anything better in the context of social media with known risks, proven risks, why on earth do we think with AI they're going to be any better at all? And this is why, for me, this is like we need to ring the alarm. You know, because, and the reason they go out there and say, oh, well, our product is an extinction, it could cause an extinction level event for humanity. And then they don't do anything to stop that. Right? So
yeah, quite.
It's surreal.
Yeah.
And I think that's the other reason why it's so important to me to make this accessible, because we're not seeing action from governments. So it's going to take people understanding the scale of the problem, I think, for anything to actually happen.
I think to take your point around the impulses that drive those in civil society, which in theory for the most part is innately about safeguarding and protection against the worst possible scenario, because we as the human race, and not the states in charge or any kind of centralized power, we need stakeholders. So civil society very much take up that charge to be the stakeholders for the safety of human beings, animals, the environment. And interesting to pick up on your sort of dwindling of the ethics boards in tech and the big companies. Of course, they're allowed to self-regulate, and self-regulation of monolith industries is innately problematic because they're marking their own homework. And of course, at the same time, what we've seen is there are tech workers actually saying, I'm becoming aware of the harm this can cause, I don't want to be a part of it, which is odd. I mean, tech workers in companies shouldn't be in this strange position where they're almost conscientious objectors or they're advocates and activists from the workplace. It's an unusual thing for them. But unilaterally, or quite frequently, they're either walking out, say Google, or they're being fired, and anyone on an ethics board who does ring the bell is quickly replaced by an ethicist who, well, these days it's a bit like lawyers. You can have an ethicist for hire and they can tell you whichever answer you want. So this is morally correct. It's doing more harm than good. And I'm in that context and the things that you've just brought up. I mean, we'll move on to, I think, jobs and how it actually changes our relationship with the world shortly. But given this particular year, there are an awful lot of elections going on. And I'm wondering, in light of what you've said, how much democratic agency and trust is at stake with this technology and in this particular moment?
Yeah, so this is the year of democracy. It's being called. Half of the world population will vote in an election this year. That scale has never happened before. And before I come to that, I just want to go very quickly back to the point you were making around the idea that, like, these companies, right? The thing to remember is these companies, their only incentive is to maximize profit. If they're publicly traded, they're legally bound to maximize profit. Where does profit and safety align, right? And the former vice president of Starbucks always used to use the example, who's now working a lot on tech accountability stuff. If even one of every 100 million coffees that Starbucks sold killed people, Starbucks wouldn't be allowed to sell coffee anymore. And we're looking at these tech companies who are already responsible for the deaths of people, insurrections, genocides, all the rest of it, with no accountability. And this is where the whole private enterprise government relationship becomes really important, and government sort of forgetting that their job is to protect people, not corporations. And the best example, which leads into the elections crisis, the White House announced a few days ago the National AI Safety Institute. Huge hoopla, this is amazing, yada, yada, yada. You talk about marking your own homework. I went to the list of who's on this board. Every AI company is on this board, every single one. Not a single ethicist that has worked on the other side of this. No human rights organizations, nothing. And an additional member, Palantir, which is owned by Peter Thiel, who was one of the largest donors to Donald Trump's campaign in 2016 and 2020. So when we talk about taking these things seriously, marking your own homework, I mean, come on. You know, it's taking the piss to a level that we can't even. Now, when we look at elections specifically, this is where, so the whole existential crisis, will the robots kill us? Maybe. But the more immediate problem, twofold, we're going to come to jobs, but in the context of democracy and elections, is reality, right? So deepfakes, I'm sure everyone's heard that term possibly by now. The idea, the way I like to describe it is it's just something that's deeply fake. It's the easiest way to understand it. And in the content, we've already seen robocalls from Joe Biden that aren't Joe Biden's voice, and you can train an AI tool on audio with 30 seconds of audio from someone. Thinking about these politicians, there's thousands and thousands of hours. 3 days ago, OpenAI launched their text-to-video tool called Sora, where with a text, you say, make a 30-second video of a mammoth wearing sweatpants walking through a forest, and it can make that. Who's stopping someone from making the 30-second video of Joe Biden burning a Bible that goes viral on social media in the Midwest that leads to a scale of civil unrest that we cannot really comprehend in this moment? But not only does it make the propensity of fake stuff more widespread, but it then makes everyone question whether things that are real are actually real. Because suddenly the things that are real, you think this might be fake. So, and democracy doesn't function without shared reality. You know, and the breakdown is so far gone already, but we're looking at this landscape with half the world voting and no mandatory controls over AI content, over AI development, dissemination, or usage. Nothing. And I'm just sort of waiting for the horrible stuff to happen, because I don't see a world where it's possible to stop it at this stage. And as an example, 3 months before the US election in 2020, there was a group of us who worked on a project that released a statement saying it is possible that social media could lead to an insurrection in the United States. Hysterical laughter. Literally, like, we can't take you seriously, this is ridiculous. January 6th comes around, and we're all sitting there like, well, I mean, we did tell you.
Yeah, quite.
You know, but the problem is that the scale to which that could happen with AI in this year is so big that you can't come back from it. And when people talk about the development, the rate of change, all the rest of it, that's fine, and it's really important, and it's super scary. I mean, we're talking about ChatGPT getting 1,000 times better in 3 months, right? But it only takes one incident from AI in the broader landscape to cause a serious, major event. So it doesn't matter how evolved it is, it matters that one thing is so bad
And unpredictably
and
so.
unpredictably so that it's game over, it's lights out.
And just to come to that point, I think you've summed it up very nicely, and I want to open up to the room on that, because I think there will be a lot of comments and concerns around the fact that this is really the perfect, most efficient propaganda tool we've ever had. But of course, it's going on everywhere. So you've got this multiverse of different information, which we already know, whether it's press barons or there has always been this propensity to try and control information to the worst degree. There are some possibilities with social media, of course. People have been able to share and collaborate. In Sudan, it was a great movement on social media before they switched off the internet. But of course, again, it's the stakeholders for people and planet that are missing. So on the back of, I'd like us to open out when we talk more about the political situation and the concerns there, because there are lots more I think we could go into in the problems of the technology. I think as we move on, one thing I would say is when we discuss the advances of the technology and we use phrases like better, it's an evolution a lot of the time in its speed and processing power and its ability to make decisions more quickly. That doesn't mean they're always necessarily correct, because they're always fundamentally based on, as Carl perfectly described, predictive analysis only based on what it's already seen. So the same AI tools are used. You may have heard of the Monte Carlo system in banks, and it's used to assess when the market might be high, when it might be low. It cannot possibly predict or account for any kind of crisis. And really, if you're investing, and certainly if you're looking after global economies, you want to know when the crises are coming. But if a thing hasn't happened, it can't model for it. So by definition, it can't model and predict the very things that we're worried about, which are the things that fall out of the predictable and known parameters. So that's I would exercise caution when you hear these tech experts saying, but it's so good and it's so much better. It's better at a certain thing, and that thing is already flawed. And I think that's something to pay attention to. It's not like a human brain, and we're learning cognitively and we're improving.
Well, and just on that point, like, I think it's really important, this human brain piece, because it's often, like, even using the phrase artificial intelligence is humanizing this thing. And one of the things I talk about in the book is the fact that we need a new language for this, right? And so like, we can't ascribe human words to this stuff, because then it makes us feel like maybe it's human. So instead of using the word artificial, I suggest we use the word computational. Instead of using the word intelligence, we use the word logic. Instead of teach, train, learn, acquire, understand, interpret. So rather than artificial intelligence tools, we're talking about computational logic bots, right? It's a small thing, but language is deeply important in how we describe stuff, and dehumanizing this will allow us to see it as something separate from us, different from us, a tool, a resource. And I should say, like, I don't think AI is inherently bad. I think the way we're allowing it to develop is the problem, right? So, and nuclear weapons for me, and nuclear technology development's a good example. Imagine if we were like, sure, private companies build nuclear bombs. Absolutely not, right? Of course we don't allow that. So when we're looking at these tools, why are we not asking ourselves the same questions? Who should be in charge of this? Who should be making decisions about how it develops? And why are we going, oh, well, hopefully something you create won't do something bad, instead of saying, we want you to create a thing that will do X. Now go away and do that. And if you can build the tool that does that, we'll pay you a lot of money for it.
I would say there is one hopeful bit in that I think the younger generations coming through who are trained in STEM are so much more socially aware that they're less likely to be and less inclined to be involved in these really unethical applications. But of course, as we've said, when the big companies are marking their own homework, they make all the decisions and they point the technology in the direction that they want, including Peter Thiel, who has a propensity for weapons technology development, which is always concerning. Parking the political concerns, because I think I feel from the audience there might be a lot of comments on that and concerns. What about jobs? It's one of the things people talk about. It's we're all being replaced. No one will have jobs. Manual labor is replaced. To what extent is that true? Is it overhyped? Is it a real problem? And if it is a problem, what do you think are our options to mitigate that?
Yeah, so when we look at jobs and the impact it has on economies and work, first we have to remember that the only way we understand our role and our ability to survive in society is that we work to get money to buy the things we need to live, right? So that's the baseline there of this assumption that this is how a society is set up. Now, when we look at the last sort of implementation of this widespread, robotics and manufacturing, primarily automotive is the most significant example, robots building cars instead of people building cars. What happened was the white-collar jobs and people who worked in white-collar jobs were insulated from that. So there was less sort of broad impact in terms of how classes interpreted that experience and how it moved up and down through the economic system. What we're seeing with AI, and mind you, like the examples I use in the book are not like some lefty, extremist sources. The main source is Goldman Sachs, who says that 2/3 of jobs in North America and Europe will be impacted by AI, with roughly 20% of jobs likely gone in 5 years. Right? And that wouldn't be a problem if the goal was like, let's have AI do tons of stuff so we can all work less and have leisure time. Right? But that's not what's happening with this. And so what I like to say with AI is it's not a tool, it's the talent. Right? So I was at an event where I was talking about it and somebody was comparing AI to Excel spreadsheets. And it was like, well, Excel spreadsheets allows a human to do a job differently, potentially more efficiently. AI will literally do the Excel spreadsheet better than you will. And that's the reality. And so what happens, right? So when we look at on a societal level, let's say 1 in 5 jobs are affected. Just 1 in 5. I mean, that's a lot of jobs, but just 1 in 5. Right? Our entire economy and how tax systems work, a lot of tax for the state is based on taxing labor. What happens when 1 in 5 people are no longer working and therefore paying tax on that labor with a system that isn't set up to tax AI doing the same job? So now you have 1 in 5 people looking to the state for money because they have no job, and a state that's lost 1 in 5 labor tax revenue line items, right? So it leads to this never-ending system where there's fewer people working, so fewer people paying tax on their labor, but more people demanding something from the state to be able to survive, because that's our understanding of how the state works. So then suddenly the state is bankrupt, there's a lot of instability and insecurity, and then that drives people more to more extreme authoritarian styles of government for people who have all the answers. Right? So it's just a self-perpetuating cycle that's fundamentally about societal instability. So I think with work, it's, again, like it would be great if computers could do tons of stuff and we could all hang out, pursue leisure activities, personal interests, but that means a fundamental rethinking of how we fund society and what a human is entitled to, right, as a basis for life and a basis for just existing. I mean, I always describe the last bastion of capitalism being universal basic income. Right? Because universal basic income isn't actually a socialist program at all. It's basically saying we accept that everything is run in capitalism, so to keep capitalism going, here's some money so you can participate. Right? But unless we move to that type of model where we ensure people have enough money to participate, then you're going to see a scale of instability that to me is just like maybe 10 years away, but to again, the sort of instantaneous nature of it, where we didn't see it coming, and you're going, we told you so.
Well, quite. The constant, I mean, we have been trying to warn you quite loudly, and the sort of, it's almost an institutional gaslighting. It's this, no, it hurts me more than it hurts you. Believe me, this is good for you. And then 10 years later, we see the results. I mean, not only are we the ones that are damaged and not you, but we've been warning you. And I think just, again, picking up on one thing and then maybe just one more question or two before we hear a little bit of the book would be lovely, and then go to questions. This broad concern about jobs, as you've said, these kind of warnings, as you break it down, it seems so obvious. And of course, the short-sightedness of both government and industry relationship, and the kind of dangerous level of lobbying there, is that, of course, they're actually gouging out of their own economy, because you will have potentially a fifth of the population not being able to contribute, not just in taxes, but then the rest of the workers are all burdened by increased taxes. So everyone's going to be miserable, and the fundaments of the economy will be reduced.
Very quick, just
please,
example of that. In the last 3 years, the wealth of the wealthiest 5 people on Earth has doubled, whereas 30% more people on Earth are living in poverty than were living in poverty 3 years ago.
I mean, I think that sums it up. Well, on that, those who are very, very powerful, there are CEOs who are in control of huge corporations, and some smaller, some startups that have a kind of ethical principle, and they say we don't want our tech to be applied a certain way, which is a very difficult thing to actually restrict. What about those CEOs who have quite publicly and loudly said, look, this is potentially a tool that can be used either accidentally or purposefully for really, really harmful purposes, including mass killings or selective killings, or aside from the erosions based on the data bias, which means that problems are ubiquitous and exponential. What about the fact that there are major CEOs with that power who are saying it, and yet we're still in the position that we are?
Do you mean like the CEOs of the companies themselves?
Some of them, yeah.
Yeah, so Sam Altman is the best example,
Yeah.
right? Our product poses an existential threat to humanity, but we're going to keep building it and doing exactly what we were doing before. So I think about that in the sense of what's called regulatory capture, which is if we shout loud enough about how our thing is so bad, then you'll ask us how we can make our thing less bad, and we'll create the rules by which no one else can participate because we've made the rules for ourselves. So if you have a financial incentive in a product and you're simultaneously saying it poses an existential threat, but you're doing nothing, I just don't trust you, believe you, or kind of care about what you have to say. I mean, again, it's the marking your own homework. It's like asking pharmaceutical companies how we make people less sick, you know? Like it's outrageous. Of course they're not going to tell you how to make people less sick. They're selling drugs to people who are sick. And these tech CEOs are making fortunes on products that are harmful. They're not going to make them less harmful when their harm is part of the reason they're profitable.
I think that was really well said. Before we hear a little bit from the book, what about some positives? It is easy to sit here and sound the alarm because it's necessary. I'd like us to discuss as a group what it is we think we can do about it, your recommendations. But what about some of the benefits of AI? It can't be all bad.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. AI could be the most amazing thing that ever happens to humanity if it is forced to develop in a way that benefits humanity. So the medical stuff, you obviously cited some examples that are troubling, but there are a lot of positives in the medical space around health. And I see huge potential around this, what I like to call the siloed AI, where you say, okay, we really want to learn or impact this specific thing, put it into the AI, see what it comes out with, obviously review it, and humanize it. So that for me is, medical is one of the biggest areas. The second is, in terms of positives, are examples where it's being done, I would say, correctly. So there's an amazing example in Japan. Japan is probably the leading place where the government sets challenges or competitions around specific outcomes or objectives. So one of them being, obviously Japan has the fastest aging population in the world, and also they have the fastest decline as relative to their total population in the world. So there are roughly 120 million people in Japan now. By 2050, there will only be 100 million people in Japan. So you lose 1/6 of your population in 25 years. When you're not really keen on people coming in, you've got to find other ways to do that. So what they run competitions around specific challenges. One of the challenges they talk about in the book was, can you build an AI that can pick a certain fruit in a greenhouse with a damage to the fruit ratio less than 3%? They ran this competition. A company was able to do it, got huge funding from the government to expand and develop this tool. And now in rural areas where people are, shocker, people aren't becoming farmers in Japan at the moment, where the aging populations are no longer able to do this work, there's AI tools that are able to do it for them. For me, it's very difficult to think about all of the positives until we fully deal with the worst case scenarios.
So then on that, taking maybe the Japanese example, I'm assuming there are a group of people in here who are British or at least have lived here for a long time. Post-Brexit, we're more isolated. We've reduced labour because we have hysterical and quite violent responses to immigration. What then for you is the answer in terms of the regulation or the application restrictions that governments should bring in and regulation of tech companies so that we enable that more positive genesis?
So first and foremost, no conflict, no war, right? I talk about the idea that we're going to live in some dystopian future where literally there are like robot wars happening, right? Why are we allowing resource and energy to go into that application as the primary usage? It's outrageous. Second is, how are we going to tax it? Because what that really is, the question you're really trying to answer with how are we going to tax it is how is society, humanity going to benefit from this innovation? And that's the role of government, right? The role of government is to say, oh, wow, this is a thing where we can make society better for all of these people. And then third, I think, is the applications that are necessary, so challenge-driven. And I talk about as well, like when the US, when JFK said, we want to put a person on the moon by the end of the 60s, right? The US government managed that program, and they said, okay, who can build the best rocket? You know, they didn't say, oh, you're building a rocket? Sure, here's some money, we hope it works. Right? So government's taking a much more interventionist approach to, and doing their jobs of saying, how can we use this thing for the benefit of citizens in our country? Or considering the fact that all of this stuff is borderless for society more broadly and humanity more broadly.
Thank you. I'm going to leave that question there because I think there's more to be said about it and I think I can pick your brain on it more. But I'm keen to move to the audience. But before that, would you be willing to read a small passage to give us an intro to the book?
Yes. So it's going to be the outro because I wanted to read the last section. The last section is called Reclaiming Humanity. It is absolutely possible that all the warnings coming from every side of the AI debate are wrong. This would be despite the fact that they form what many might call a consensus, quite similar to the one we have with regard to climate change. Another warning we did not heed and for which we are now suffering the consequences. If technology experts, human rights activists, governments, and the companies themselves are all incorrect, and AI development in its current form will usher in a utopian wonderland where everyone is happier and healthier and we can solve all the most pressing problems facing humanity, then we have nothing to worry about. But what if they aren't wrong? The alternative is possible human extinction. When that's the risk, shouldn't we be taking every precaution possible to avoid bringing about our own demise? Disregarding the worst case scenario of bringing about an extinction level event, there is still much damage to be wrought on humanity by the artificial intelligence tools that already exist. Doing our taxes or programming some computer code is one thing, but writing novels, composing music, and making art is another altogether. Suddenly, what exactly is the point of humanity? What does it mean to live when a computer can ostensibly do near everything better than we can? If we're not careful, we just might make our entire species redundant.
Thank you for that. On that note, I'm going to intravenously inject some of this wine so I feel more happy. That was terrifying. That was beautifully written, thank you. I think this is a good moment to open to the room because I'd really like to hear your perspectives, any challenges to Kyle, any more questions. Of course, there's so much detail to go into. And I'm wondering if anyone, I know there's always an initial silence as we get up the nerve. There's one at the back. Ella, do we have microphones for questions or are we going? That's all right. We can hear you. Gentleman at the back.
That's a great question, and I think that for me, it's important for us to remember as individuals that there isn't a ton that we can do on our own. And I compare it to stopping using plastic straws when 100 companies produce 71% of all greenhouse gas emissions, right? Like the number one thing you can do is not allow yourself to be made to feel as if you're personally responsible for this enormous, huge problem. But secondary, I mean, it's just about pushing political parties and governments to act. And I think we're in a state in the UK in particular where it kind of feels like there's no point in doing that. And I hope there's a sense of democratic renewal this year where
our great choices of availability.
Where people perhaps feel like they can, in fact, influence the government that's meant to serve them, the government that they fund, the government that is elected with people who are supposed to represent them. But I will tell you, as somebody who works with in advocating with governments, that they do not get the scale of the problem at all. And unfortunately, I think it's going to take a major event for them to clue in. But I think we have to be ready when that major event happens to then say, see, this can't happen again. And hopefully the event that does happen isn't so bad that we do have the opportunity to change things. But I think in the short term, it's about when these conversations come up, reminding people that there's nothing wrong with there being possible positives as long as we make sure we mitigate for the worst possible things. And I think because we're living in this time where like things feel really hard and things are really hard, we don't want to think about the worst possible things. But it's so, so important because we're living through the greatest change in how we as humans live since nuclear was developed. And that is huge. It's monumental. Yeah. Sorry, I was caught by how monumental it was for a moment.
No, I would add that there are levers that the public can pull. I mean, aside from the fact that we should be able to vote for better representatives, but there's a dearth of that, so let's put that to one side. If there are tech workers who are, leaving, or they are saying that we're not going to have our work contributing, there are students that we work with who are influencing their unions to say, I don't want my PhD research going towards bad actor technology, whether it's the dual use of technologies that could be used in weapon scenarios. But for the kind of regular public that doesn't work in that sphere, as we know with political sanctions, you can personally sanction stuff and you can say, I'm not going to buy from this. And aside from the current sort of BDS movements and things going on, an example I always draw from is the big Nestle campaign, which was, I think, in the 80s probably, where Nestle said, we're going to provide powdered milk across Africa and all these mothers were going to solve infant mortality and starvation. But what they didn't think of was, because that wasn't really where their mind and their concern and their care was, that the water you would use to dilute the milk with, the powder to make a liquid milk, was all highly polluted and contaminated, a source of disease. So they actually increased infant mortality. But in the UK and a lot of Western countries where it's stocked, they just stopped buying it and it just sat on the shelves. So they changed their policy. That is a power we have. And the other is, a lot of you are part of unions if you're teachers, you have teacher pensions unions. They are massive, massive wealth funds, sometimes into the billions. And they have a lot of say over where their money is invested. They can control that. And one of the things that we advocate, in fact, after some increased regulation on nuclear weapons came in with a treaty to ban nuclear weapons, the profitability in the market in nuclear weapons development within 1 year dropped by 63 billion. That is a lot of money. Nuclear weapons are still there, states still build them, but as a profitable thing that asset managers and banks invest in, that can have a profound impact. So we're not completely lost and we're not completely without power. And I would, if we're bringing out the positives, I would say it's worth bearing in mind that our choices very much hit that profit line as well, though of course we don't have as much choice as we should.
No, but it's great that somebody. I spend too much time in this to. I struggle to find positives. So I appreciate.
It's all right, that's why I'm here. That's what the wine is for.
I spent the summer in Bangladesh interviewing Rohingya refugees who died in a genocide because of Facebook. So I'm like, everything's terrible.
On that note, question at the front.
Governments are so passive because the only thing they're ever thinking about is inward investment. It's truly unbelievable. They see AI as a growth sector without even remotely engaging with the scale of job loss that comes with that growth sector. And they love being in with tech bros. I mean, I'm sorry, if anyone saw the Rishi Sunak, Elon Musk love fest.
It was so embarrassing, wasn't it?
It was unbelievable. I mean, Rishi Sunak was being ostensibly interviewed by Elon Musk, but by the end, I couldn't tell who was interviewing who. I thought it just ended up being a job interview for Rishi's next job.
Well, he knows he has to find one, to be fair. I mean,
they love tech, love it. And we call it the tech exception. For some reason, with tech, nobody seems to ever look at it. People in positions of power never seem to look at it just like what it is, which is a for-profit business trying to maximize profit. And so it does take a lot for a government to change course and remember and look at, I always say, look at the numbers. You know, so you look at cities, for example, that try and attract a company to move their headquarters through tax incentives. But what does the company do? They move the headquarters 6 months before the tax incentive ends to another city that gives them a tax incentive. But I think this is why we are where we are with that.
And in my experience of them, and I think most people would know or have a sense of this, they just don't understand it and they don't know what they're talking about. I remember my work with government in the UK, but I remember when the hearings and you had Zuckerberg and people being interviewed about online harms, and the people asking the questions just were so completely out of touch. They were asking, I mean, they may as well have asked, and how do you switch it on again? I mean, it's that level of disconnect between those who are involved in policy and those building the technology.
And remember things like Meta employs one public policy person in the United States for every congressperson. So there's someone that works at Meta whose entire job is to advocate to one specific congressperson, right? And the EU works quite similarly. In the UK, the team is huge. And I actually was having a conversation the other day around tech policy where, and what they often ask civil society is, well, is that technically possible? I don't care if it's technically possible. These companies are reporting $20 billion in profits a quarter. They can make it technically possible if you tell them they have to, right? But with tech in particular, it's like, oh, but can you? Who cares? I don't care if you can. Do. It's like asking a drug company, like, can you make a drug that doesn't, kill 1 in 10? Well, of course, they must, right? But with tech, it's surreal. And I think, again, it's the generational divide as well. We're sort of looking at the octogenarian election in the United States and the role that tech has played in society. And we're just cusping having people in positions of power who do get it, right? Where you don't have to explain, like, I don't know, metadata or like encryption or like very simple things to a legislator. They'll just know it. And they'll have personal experiences of it that allow them, that make them feel informed enough to understand what you're saying.
Do you think that's going to be a hopeful transition when the inevitable replacement of the existing governance structures just gets employed by people who've grown up with this technology and have a different relationship with it?
Yes, as long as they haven't already been captured by the tech themselves, and that's the additional risk. But again, if we look at sort of like a major event this year, which I think is 100% likely, in one of these elections around the world, we'll at least have an example to point to. Though we just have to remember the amount of effort it takes to get anything done. And as I said, again, there is not a single federal law that's been passed in the United States related to social media regulation since we learned about Cambridge Analytica and had an insurrection. So be hopeful, but be vigilant.
And to add, I remember when we were pointing out that there were credit cards making essentially sexist or racist decisions as to who they would even give a credit card to, because it was based on presumptions from the data you described. And the companies get a fine, absolutely recognize that it's a problem, and they violate it.
Cost of doing business.
Yeah, it's completely ineffective.
No, that's a real thing that they consider a lot of these fines a cost of doing business, because the fine is still relatively. So for the Cambridge Analytica scandal, there were nearly 2 million UK users whose data was taken without their consent. Facebook's fine was £500,000. That's a cost of doing business.
I'm just scanning around to see if there are any more questions or comments. Yes, sir. Thank you.
I mean, in this regulatory environment, no, right? Because governments right now are not set up. Everything you've seen or read in the news around commitments from AI companies, the fine print is everything's voluntary. Nothing is mandatory. And that includes reporting, right? So we can't even know if they're voluntarily dealing with the issues if there's no transparency around what the issues were. So again, it's hard, and I'm glad that you're here with some positives, because I really, really struggle to find positives at the moment. And I think about the genocide in Myanmar, and I think of Rohingya Muslims, and I think, why is nobody saying to Meta, until you can prevent a genocide, you can't do anything else? Right? That doesn't even seem unreasonable. But that isn't what's going to happen. And with AI this year in particular, my example would be their release of Sora, this text-to-video tool 3 days ago. And they're like, oh, well, we released it to just see if there's safety concerns. And it's like, the fuck are you talking? Of course there's safety concerns. You can type in a sentence of text and make any video you want. Those safety concerns are inherent and obvious. So, I'm not hugely hopeful that I don't think they will do anything they don't have to do. And so, and I think because of the scale of the crisis, I don't understand why we're not having massive global meetings around how to rein this in. And the reason I'm doubly surprised is because every party that's currently in power that wants to retain power is also at risk. So they're personally invested in something not being terrible, because they could also lose the election, and yet they still don't do anything. And I think it goes back, they don't really understand how it works. They've been wined and dined to the ends of, just endlessly treated incredibly well by these companies. And so they don't see how something can happen so quickly that's so dramatic. because in their lifetimes, perhaps that hasn't actually happened. I mean, I would argue that the insurrections in the US and Brazil were that, but it doesn't seem like that really stuck with people.
It is a question, isn't it? What you mentioned, an event, but what's going to be a big enough event? I mean, I would add on the sort of weapons technologies and this impulse to, I mean, having spoken to people, there's a lot of, we want the new toy, and we have a bit of fear of missing out. Aside from actual defense responses, there are so many companies that just want to be able to say, I've spoken to some programmers who will say, I'm helping build something for them, and they say, but we want it to be AI. And they don't really know why they want it to be AI, because they don't understand what the AI really, really does, but they want to be able to say it because it's cool and it makes them seem on the cutting edge. And the thing that we've tried very hard to get across, especially to parliamentarians, is to say, and I remember someone at the Lord's inquiry into military use, was it's not magic, it's not pixie dust, it's just statistical analysis, it's just really fast maths. It's not actually coming up with a new video, it's just plonking together all the things that exist. It cannot do something original. And if there is an embedded mistake at the programming stage, then that would be exponentially worse and magnified. And on the sort of the arms race that you've described, another thing we described to them, and I think, or tried to get across to them, which at the moment just falls on deaf ears, certainly to the sort of tech and military empowered states, exactly what you've said politically is this sense of there is a lack of awareness that in the using of it, there's actually a risk of fratricide, so health, self-harm, self-damage. And there are countries all over the world that won't have AI military technology, for example, but all that does is flares up asymmetric warfare. So if I use my fancy autonomous drone and you don't have one, you might use your chemical weapons, because you might have to go, or you think you're being forced to go back to dirty warfare to fight back. And all of the cyber concerns, so financial implications, fiddling with our traffic light systems. There's no end to the way other states that don't have the same technology and access to the big companies will actually end up defending themselves in much more worrying ways. I mean, nuclear weapons and...
Yeah, no, I was going to just add to that and saying there's also no end to how states who can't afford it themselves will find ways to manipulate what you have.
Absolutely.
Also, right? So people often think that like there was an objective with Russian activity in the 2016 election, which 17 US intelligence agencies agreed was the case. The underlying objective is just broad distrust of institutions and a broad sense of what can I trust, nothing is real. Right? So just erase the idea of that a factual information environment exists, create broad uncertainty. That's the goal. Because if you're all spinning around what's real and what isn't, we'll just carry on doing what we're doing over here. And it's cheap. Relatively for states, it's cheap to do that.
I think that's also something to remember before we go back to the crowd and look to closing, is that this is actually cheap technology, that there will come a point that, well, it exists now. Anyone can download it. You could buy a drone off the internet and put some program in it. And increasingly, we have generations who are very technologically savvy and aware and grew up with it, even a way that I didn't. I mean, mobile phones were even quite new to us, I have to say, and computers at home. I can't believe how much we've changed just in the last 20 or 30 years. But this, just to reiterate your point about the fact that it can be used against us very easily, is that even if you create in this sort of arms race, just because it's an easy, tangible example to use, but it broadly applies to everything. If you have a weapon and I don't have it, but I've got some programmers, I can just turn your weapon against you, or I can tell your weapon that it's seen something that it hasn't. And it's exactly the same problem, because it's exactly the same technology. It's just applied in different areas. And this inability or this lack of willingness to verify the kind of legend, the root of data from the start to the finish, there is no propensity for it, because no government wants to share their data. No tech company wants to open their patents and their IP. And that, I think, is one of the fundamental problems, is no one wants to be checked, do they?
And it's just as a final point,
Please.
like this is the irony as well of the competition that comes from market forces, right? So Google had built Bard their AI tool years and years ago to a point where it was publicly ready, but they would not release it because they said it wasn't safe. Then OpenAI released ChatGPT, and because there were market forces involved, Google could not release Bard. They had to compete. And so even the competitive marketplace has meant that we have products out there that are unsafe because they're more worried about market share than they are about safety.
And in the chat case, they brought it online knowing it was also early and unsafe, but they wanted to test it on the public. That was part of the teaching of the system, was to release it too early.
And they call, when it makes stuff up, hallucinations, which I think is hilarious. And they tried to suggest that 4 was less hallucinogenic than 3.5, but actually all independent and internal testing has showed that ChatGPT 4 is more often wrong than ChatGPT 3.5. Are we done?
On that, any final burning questions before we close? Well, I want to thank you all for coming. I want to hand over to Stephen and thank Kyle. And this is Stephen, who runs Byline Times.
Thank you, Tanel. I just really want to say thanks to the two of you. The thing about Kyle is he's not only written this book from Tokyo, which I never quite understand how he does that, but he also actually came up with the whole Little Black Book concept, which is fantastic, because the great thing about Little Black Books are they're very, very accessible, as he says, but they're incredibly smart, and it's the combination of those two things. They're very heavily researched. I think Matt over here, Matt Gallagher, helps with a lot of the research as well as promoting the books. But Carl, you've done a fantastic thing with these Little Black Books, and I would really encourage you to look at the other ones we've done here. What they do is they make you feel really well informed, which is great, because even I think I understand a bit about AI now. But they also, and I think it's hardest with this one actually, but they actually give you a little bit of either a survival guide or sort of tips about what you can do about it. So I think that's what's really positive about them as well. So Carl, fantastic job. And Carl really runs Byline Books. I just sort of keep an eye on it, really. And Ella, where's Ella? Ella Badley. Ella sort of is our head of operations, and she makes everything work as well in terms of Byline Books. And also she put all this together as well. So thanks very much, Ella. It's brilliant.
Thank you for coming.
And we have John Mitchinson, who came fashionably late, who managed to get us into the bookshops, which we never thought we would do. So that's fantastic. So thanks so much, John. That's great as well. Just to these two here. So Carl, thanks so much. I know you just flew in yesterday, was it? Saturday. Where did you fly in from? Tokyo. From Tokyo. Amazing. And Tanel, who I think I don't know who rang her up, but we said, could she come along and interview Carl? We know Tanel knows. Tanel knows a huge amount of this. She's part of the Byline family and always does fantastic things to us. So thanks very much for doing this. Just one last thing, Carl. I did take your point. I hope I got this right. That the problem with AI. I mean, one is that we have got to change governments, and I think perhaps you left the media out of this, because I think the media, what we do at Byline Times, or the other media, we've got a responsibility to actually be on government's case. I take what you said. This government, it's very hard to be on their case because they are very self-serving. Carl also writes a monthly column in Byline Times, a tech column, The Tech Effects, which is really good, and I would urge you to look at that. But I think the media is very important in this. But also, I think what you've put out very clearly in this, and I think your terminology and language is important with this, because AI should serve us. We should not serve AI. It reminds me, I think Peter York's in here somewhere, an old advertising compadre of mine knows about advertising. There used to be, in the late 80s, a very famous ad, which was when Fiat was very excited about the fact that their cars were made by robots. And they put up billboards all over London showing, and all over the country saying, our new Fiats are made by robots. And some bright spark on television showed a picture of a junkyard and said, made by robots but driven by Italians. And that's the point, really. If you don't know how to use what the robots do and actually and keep control of them, you're going to have a problem. So that's what I took out of it. I hope I took the right thing out of it. And I would like to thank all of you for coming over to the bookshop. And for asking such good questions. I'm sure Carl and Tanel, you're around for informal chats. There's a lot of, I think there's quite a bit of alcohol, isn't there, Ella? Yeah, there's a lot of alcohol. We need you to drink all that before we leave, because we have paid for it. So we really would. We prefer you to carry it home in your stomachs, but you know, if not some other way. And also, we do have some books that I think Carl will sign. I think you'll even sign them for people's mums and dads, if need be. So there will be a little bit of a signing going on over there. We can take credit cards. We're not very good at IOUs, but we can take credit cards. So I think we should just clap each other, because it's great to have such a good group here. Thank you very much.